Now, I don't know how easy you find it to get motivated, but if you're anything like me, you're pretty well motivated for the things that you like. Not so much for the things that you don't like. But where do we source that motivation? Where or what switches a light on or puts that switch on that makes you motivated? Do you know what it is? I'd love to hear how you found it. My next guest has been looking very much at what causes us to be motivated and what's happening in our brain to make that happen. My guest is Associate Professor Jess Nithianantharajah, and she's head of the Synapse Biology and Cognition Laboratory at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Jess, good afternoon.
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for having me.
It is great to talk with you. Now, this all comes back to mice and rats, where we first started learning about motivation.
That's it.
Can you explain that model that you set up and what you found out from this?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just to take a step back, maybe I can quickly start to share with you some of the overall arching themes that our research sort of looks at, and then we can get into the specifics.
Sure.
So we've been really interested in starting from, just how the connections that form the wiring in our brain allow us to perform complex behaviours, all the different mental processes that we constantly use to navigate our way through life. And what's interesting is that these connections are really made up of these molecules, that are these building blocks that enable this communication in the brain. Now, I want to share something with you, which I've always found really interesting, which is that these molecules have really evolved in humans and other mammals compared to other simple vertebrates, for example. So there's been a natural evolutionary process that's given us more behaviours and more behavioural options to navigate the world. And it's also interesting that these same molecules have been implicated across a wide range of neurodevelopmental disorders.
What do you mean by that? Because for many people that would be a very foreign concept.
Yeah. Do you mean in terms of these molecules and their role in disorders? So what we know about when we start to look at neurodevelopmental disorders, and when I say that, I'm referring to a range that includes things like depression, mood disorders, autism spectrum disorders, and schizophrenia. And those disorders, you might say, well, hold on a minute, but they do have aspects of, let's say, depression associated with those. They all have early sort of developmental origins in some ways. And we know that it's really around the connectivity in the brain that is altered. And so what we know is that these molecules that are really important for making these connections not only are really important for driving behaviour, but they're really important, and they're the ones that are aberrant across a lot of brain disorders.
And are molecules like that fixed, or do they change?
Yeah, well, so when we start off, I guess in some ways, people talk about it in terms of a template. So there is an early sort of template that gives rise to the brain, but as you know, there's always plasticity through during young and always in the adult phase as well. But it really comes down to that sort of early template that sort of sets that up.
Yeah.
So coming back to your early question, we've been particularly interested in a set of molecules that shape behaviour and regulate in some ways these sort of go and stop signalling in the brain. So it's a little bit like needing an accelerator and a brake when driving a vehicle. The brain communication really has this sort of balance. And so we've been using some of these models and we've unveiled some really exciting information that tells us a little bit about how disrupting one of these molecules can really change motivation, but it doesn't necessarily change how information is encoded in the brain or how learning is impacted.
Oh, okay. So motivation is the key that lots of us are interested in.
Yeah.
So so we can change that molecule?
You can this is the key. So part of some of the work that we do, and I guess it's to do around discovery neuroscience, is understanding the biological basis of these things. So you've just touched on something I think that's really key, which is we've never really known what are the biological and molecular processes that drive one behaviour versus another. And so when you think about motivation, and I've always been interested in how we learn from our environment, learning and memory, all those kinds of things. And motivation and learning generally have been very intimately intertwined. And what I mean by that is people think that if you're not motivated towards something, that you might not really acquire information about that. And what we've been able to show is that it's not as simple as that. And the brain actually has specific biological bases and or molecules that can shape one kind of behaviour, i.e. motivation, but not learning. And that's what we found in some work that's recently about to be published, which is we looked at this particular molecule that's important for GO connections in the brain called neuroligin 1. And, many years ago it was discovered and people knew that it was really important for plasticity, for example, and signalling in the brain. And they did some work that showed that it was important for spatial learning. And so it was just sort of accepted that this was really important. What we showed using a set of assays that I'd like to tell you about in a moment is that these animals that lack this particular protein had no problems in being able to learn new information and update information about the world, but that their motivation and willingness to make responses when demands actually increased was what was really impacted.
So is that
the brain separates those two processes? Yeah.
Is that why I can know that physical activity is good for me and still not want to exercise?
I think there's an element of that. That's exactly right. I think once upon a time one would associate them together, but you don't want to, you purely don't want to do exercise because you don't maybe have awareness around the value of it around. And here what we're saying is that, learning about a concept and then how you choose to actually then engage and activate on that can be quite differentially processed. And I think, again, here, what's really important is understanding how the brain processes that allows us to be able to target one over the other. And I think this is where my interest in understanding the biological basis of disorders and mental disorders becomes really important, because things like depression, and you might know this, is one of those symptoms that sits underneath a lot of brain disorders. And what we want to do going forward in terms of really targeted therapies is we want to be able to treat the depressive-like symptoms without, disturbing that individual's capacity to be able to perform all the other wonderful mental processes we need to do in order to maintain daily functioning.
Now, all of this sounds fascinating, but I think many of us would like to know whether we can up that learning and up that motivation to a point where it removes the frustrations we have with ourselves, whether it be through a neurological disorder or just day-to-day living. Is that possible from what you're looking at the moment? So
break that down for me. Are you talking about how is it that we can enhance our own motivation for something?
Yes.
I think that's such an individual metric in many ways.
Like what I think for many people, they say, well, I'm just not motivated to do that. But we feel that's a very fixed area.
No.
Is it likely we could learn and change those molecules in our brain to be more motivated?
Yeah, absolutely. So one is in terms of changing the molecules in the brain. But I think you said this right at the start when you were introducing it. For all of us, we're navigating our world, and what we're motivated towards is really defined by what we think is important for our own kind of survival. So absolutely, there is always plasticity in the brain and in our behaviours that allow those regulations to be updated, let's say. And so that is a continual process. And I think that's a wonderful thing about the brain, is that there is always and we've been able to show this, there's always plasticity. And this comes back to these connections. There's a lot of plasticity that happens between, in terms of the connectivity in our brain that happens all throughout life. So that can absolutely be updated.
Yeah.
But maybe I can tell you a little bit about, one of the things I wanted to tell you is that, I guess some of this work that we're starting to uncover really comes from having really robust models in animals. So you alluded to this at the start in that, we're using mice and rats. And for some people, they might say, well, why is that? And the reality is that these animal models are really vital for medical translation. So I want to quickly tell you about how is it that we measure maybe motivation in mice and rats. Can I?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is definitely where I wanted to start. So let's find out about this. This sounds like an amazing research.
And so one of the things is coming back to, in terms of advancement, technology really powers that in some way. And, these nuanced behavioural tools that I want to tell you about has really been underpinned by the fact that they're essential for how we go forward. How do we start to understand how we as humans make decisions, attend to information, update information about the world and make decisions for the future. And so a really great behavioural tool I started working with about 12 years ago, actually, when I trained in the UK, were essentially these little iPads for mice. And so this tool was developed with the idea of boosting medical translation. And what we have is...
Hang on. You're saying a mice is using an iPad?
Absolutely. Wait for it. So we place animals in these little arenas where there are little touch screens on one side, and we can display lots of different visual stimuli. And if they make a correct response, they get a little reward. And what we do is we give them strawberry milk, which they absolutely love. And if they get it wrong, a little light comes on just to tell them that it was wrong. And so what's really interesting about this is, firstly, it's non-aversive. It's completely self-paced in that the animal gets to dictate whether they want to respond or not. Coming back to this motivation, that's exactly how we navigate the world. If we don't want to do something, we don't do it. We can change the stimuli that we display to look at things like spatial learning versus visual learning, for example. And lastly, we've taken advantage of these little infrared beams that are inside to really track how long animals take to make actions, to capture things like reaction speeds and processing speed that we know is really important for human cognition.
And how long did it take with the mice?
Well, it's about seconds, so there's different, depends on which question it is. So there are different types of actions. So how long does it take the animal to approach the screen, for example, versus making a selection? And we know that we can dissociate those two. What we see, just like we would, is that the animal comes up to the screen and they'll actually think about it. They'll look at the stimuli that you've presented them and they will make the selection based on their own previous experience. And so what's wonderful about this technology is this has really provided us with a nuanced approach to really try and dissect out these really complex behaviours. And that comes back to, as I was saying, once upon a time, you might look at somebody, we might look at a student and say, well, that student isn't learning because maybe they can't learn, but maybe it's got to do with motivation. There's those two kind of concepts, I guess, in many ways are really important for us and all the things that we do in life. And we're starting to show that, again, at the brain level, at the molecular level, we can dissect those and model those. And that provides us with really unique opportunities going forward for translation.
And so how do you feel it would differ for someone who has one of those neuro conditions that you were talking about earlier compared to someone who doesn't? Would that makeup look different? Is that your hypothesis?
That's it. So you've just tapped on it. So one of the things I wanted to say, and I alluded to, is that we know that these family proteins we're particularly working with, neuroligands, we know that human mutations in those genes that encode those molecules are found across neurodevelopmental disorders, across autisms and schizophrenias and depression. And so what we're hoping is that we're starting to again say that we can model these. So now what we have is a really great platform to really enable the idea, a passion that I have about delivering effective and targeted therapies towards this idea of precision medicine. I guess in terms of disorders, one of the things is we've sort of approached it so far because based on what we've had is this sort of one-size-fits-all, looking for a single magic pill that was going to really work for everyone that had different sets of mental or behavioural symptoms. But that was never going to work. And so what we now hope is that these models allow us to really approach this in a way to really drive drug discovery, and also from a diagnosis point of view in a more targeted and individualised approach.
You're listening to ABC Radio Adelaide, South Australia and Broken Hill. My guest is Associate Professor Jess Nithianantharajah from the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, taking a look at this latest research about learning and motivation and memory and attention and all of those sorts of things. Jess, so you were talking about what you were hoping to do with people who have those conditions, but what about the average person who perhaps doesn't have that condition? Is there anything in there for those people?
I think you're right. So one of the things I think that we are getting better at understanding, so when we talk about disorders, I guess we're talking about a population that sits on one end of the spectrum because the symptoms have come out. But we know that all of us fall along a wide spectrum. And so part of what we hope to do now, I guess, coming back to the plasticity you were talking about, is how can we modulate and manipulate the levels of these? And so I think these approaches are not going to only be effective in terms of the disorders, but for everyone who lies somewhere whereby it's disrupted. And so coming back to this idea of the connections in the brain, we do know that obviously the wiring for all of us is very different. And so there are, I think, applications from this work that has wider wider utility aside from just being targeted at disorders.
I'm looking at our text line and a couple of people are just saying, I just want to know how to be motivated and, like how to get more motivation. Are we likely to find out any more about that?
Well, we do. So one of the things that we're absolutely looking at, I guess it's the next level for us, is so far we know that there are certain key brain regions that are really important. But, brain regions as a whole are not going to tell us about the subtleties of specific pathways. And so that's where we're at right now. We're actually looking to identify, using these approaches and models that I've shared with you, can we identify the pathways that are really important for driving those circuits? And then we've got lots of amazing technologies that allow us to maybe be able to activate those pathways in ways that would boost our motivation. So these are the kinds of approaches that are absolutely coming online now, and we hope will be able to be translated in a way very soon. But first of all, we've got to get the models right, which is exactly what we've been able to show we can do.
Indeed, and that is happening right here in Australia at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Thanks for joining us today, Jess.
Thanks so much for having me.
Associate Professor Jess Nithianantharajah, Head of the Synapse Biology and Cognition Laboratory at the Florey Institute.